jump right in. Today we're talking about the Ten Commitments, and obviously this is a play on the Ten Commandments. Um, I think Christopher Hitchens probably has the iconic essay from a secular point of view on the Ten Commandments, the Judeo-Christian Ten Commandments. Just to give him his brief overview of that, he always liked to point out that the first thing you should ask someone when they're extolling the virtues of the Ten Commandments is which one. There are four. There are four sets in the Bible. Again, because we all know the Bible's a contradictory source of information at best. Um, so there were four lists that contradicted each other to a certain level. If you look at the most popular, the most often quoted set, he broke them down in this way. He pointed out that the first two commandments are really just about, he called it throat clearing. It's the I'm God and no one else, and you shouldn't worship anybody else. And which, by the way, when the commandments say don't worship any other gods, it's kind of a tacit admission that there's more than one, but they don't like to talk about that. But there you go. So right away, this list that's supposed to be the ultimate list of ethics for Judeo-Christian folks, it wastes 20% of its list on throat clearing and things that have nothing to do with ethics. And by the way, the third one's pretty much in that category as well, because it says don't take God's name in vain. Well, I think that might be the most violated commandment on the face of the planet, other than coveting, perhaps. But we'll get to that in a minute. But clearly, so you're 30% in, and no real ethics rules, right? So you've wasted 30% of your chances in building a list of ethics. So then you get to the fourth one that says keep the seventh day holy, which is weird and unusual because how many people have actually died or been oppressed because people couldn't agree on which day was number 7, right? Complete nonsense. Um, so now you're 4 in, right? You're 40% of the way in, and there's no mention of things like genocide or rape or slavery. Those things are fine, at least so far. In fact, we know by the time we get to the end, it's fine. Those things are fine. In fact, there's even rules for them if you go in other parts of the Bible. So you get to the fifth one, and it demands that you honor your parents. But it doesn't demand that parents don't commit child abuse or degradation of their children's psyches or any of the other terrible things. That's very much a two-way type of situation. There's nothing wrong with honoring your parents, but that honoring your parents has to be based on something, and in this case, it's not. The sixth one tells you you can't kill and murder people, but then later in the Bible it gives you rules for deciding who to kill and murder. For example, you can't suffer a witch to live. Well, what does that mean? It means you have to kill them, but don't kill. So it's not only contradictory, but it's setting you up to say, no, this is wrong, but when you're ready to violate this rule, we'll tell you who you can kill. And that is deeply insidious. The seventh says don't commit adultery, and that's fine for what it is. But really what that's saying is that you can't say, your marriage is never over. And most certainly from the woman's point of view, that they have no rights within marriage to end a bad marriage. In fact, many Christian organizations until relatively recently, and some still, say that marriage isn't over until somebody dies, no matter how horrible they treat you. And this no adultery this adultery prohibition is really just an extension of that type of thing, because it also excludes alternative forms of commitment, and that in and of itself is inappropriate. The eighth says don't steal. Okay. The only question I would have there is it doesn't take into consideration to how some people got their property. There's the classic ethical test called the Heinz test, which essentially says, would you steal to save your spouse or your children from hunger or disease or things like that? The point being of that test is to show that even supposedly simple commandments like don't steal have ethical limits, that there are higher ethics than just not stealing. The ninth says, don't bear false witness. Hitchens says that of all of them, that's probably the most subtle, sophisticated rule, because you can't have a society if people are encouraged to lie about someone's legal status or situation. So he gives that one a relative pass. And then 10, the final one, it says not to covet your neighbor's possessions. This too sounds like something that you go, oh, okay, fine, I won't do that because it causes problems. But wait, why is this commandment about someone's property? Why is it about property and not about quality of life? It's true. You shouldn't just, like the stealing, well, you shouldn't just go and take somebody's stuff in general because it leads to social chaos. But not wanting what someone else has is really a subtle way to say the society that you've been born into, even if you've been born into a lower socioeconomic rung, is what God wants. So don't rebel, don't strive, don't try to be anything different, don't go for social justice isn't a thing. It's all embedded in that last commandment that says don't covet, because the people who rule you and already have all the resources are the one that God wants to rule you and have all the resources. So with the possible exception of 9 and the minor exception for 8, 80% of this list, which Christians want to put in public courthouses and capitol buildings and high schools and all those types of, it has nothing, not only has nothing to do with ethics, but it treats women and children as property, by and large. It is a horrendous set to base your personal ethics on, and Hitchens was very clear about that in his traditional takedown of the Ten Commandments. So he says in that essay near the end, he says, well, any set of modern humans, you take a random group of modern humans and say create 10 rules to live by, would come up with a better list. Just by being regular, decent people, they wouldn't even have to be atheists and humanists. Just decent people who are living their lives, give us 10 rules for everyone to follow, would be better than this. So Hitchens has some suggestions. He points out, as I did earlier, based on his recommendation, there's no rules in there about genocide or racism or slavery or rape or tons of other things that we know are horrific, but are not addressed in those 10 commandments. In fact, in parts of the Bible are encouraged, or at least you're told how to rape someone in an ethical way, which makes me almost vomit in my mouth just to say, but that's what it says. It's horrible stuff. So he suggests that there can be a better top 10. And so the Humanist Association published this past month, the American Humanist Association. And on the front of your little program is a graphic representing what they propose as the 10 commitments. First of all, there's a difference in the name right away, right? Commandments. You have to do it to be good, or at least to be in the club, to be in acquiescence. Commitments is a choice that you make. You own what you're doing. You have agency. You are an independent thinking person, and you have chosen to adhere to these, not because someone threatened you with both pain in this life and pain everlasting, but these make sense to you, and thus you're going to adopt them and interpret them for your life. And indeed, interpretation is a large bit of it. So let's take a quick look, and then we can just have a general discussion. So in looking at these, they really break down into 3 groups. It's how you choose to develop and regulate yourself. It's how we interact with others, and how we engage with the world in our existence. So developing ourselves and others, we have things like critical thought. Critical thought's very important to me personally. I can always remember the very first time I read Carl Sagan's essay called The Baloney Detection Kit. And, it's a set of critical thought rules, and he explains how they work and why they're important. For example, he taught one of the rules is the misunderstanding of statistics. And he recounts a story that President Eisenhower was deeply upset because a report noted that 50% of all American children were below average when it came to IQ. He was upset. What can we do? How can we get how can we get everyone above average IQ? You can't because that's what average means. It doesn't matter what the actual measure is. There's always going to be 50% below average because that's what average means. And so they wasted time talking about this public, because they didn't understand statistics. So, I can still remember that when I really started to engage with critical thinking. I think, and in some of our schools actually teach this now, but I don't. Unfortunately, my son went through a critical thought class here in the county. It really wasn't critical thought at all. It was very non-critical for a critical thought class. We have things like ethical development, and it's pushing the individual. The individual accepts this because it's a commitment, not a commandment. To focus on being a better person. Um, I wish ethical philosophy was taught in high school. In fact, I used to work for a college that would bring high school students in for a week during the summer, and one of the things they were required to do with us is go through a week-long ethical philosophy seminar. And at the end of that, they would always just, it was invariable. They would just say, "Why isn't this taught in high school?" This is, because we would have incredibly valuable and deep conversations. And we didn't even tell them which one was right. We just started with key classical philosophers and the schools they represented and walked up to modernity. And it just provided an opportunity for them to think about what ethics meant to them. It was an incredibly important thing. And I think schools get afraid of teaching something that touches ethics, because if you don't put religion in it, then, well, how dare you not talk about my faith? And then if you do put religion in it, which you shouldn't, you'll have us on your doorstep saying, "Why are you putting religion into this?" So they don't. So they just choose not to. Even at the college level, even at the graduate level, one of the classes I took in my graduate level, the professor we had was a retired college president, and he asked us the question. He said, "It was higher education leadership." He said, "Should you, or the institution you work for, should educate, should they teach ethics to their students?" Well, I said yes, they should. And he said, "No, you shouldn't. It's none of the institution's business what your ethics are," which is how you get Enron. But nevertheless, so the two other points under personal development are, for me, humility and responsibility. Humility, I always connect that to a standard called intellectual humility. Um, and it was really developed by a guy by the name of Richard Paul. He's a critical thought expert. And he pointed out that intellectual humility is one of the core parts of being an ethical person. And that's the idea that your ideas are not right simply because they're your ideas, or because you grew up with them, or because that's what you were taught. That no idea has protection because of where it comes from or who it is. It has to stand on its own, and you can't give your ideas a special protection just because they're yours. So, I've spent most of my life in higher education. You'd be surprised how difficult a concept that is for folks in higher ed to get. They don't like to be told that their ideas are wrong, because their work is based on their ideas. And their responsibility, which is pretty straightforward, just simply you're responsible for your actions. We then have how to interact with others. We've got peace and social justice. I was very proud of them for linking the two. The chant that's very right, you hear it frequently and it's right, is that you can't have peace if you don't have justice. Peace is not the absence of war, it's the presence of justice. It's 1,000% right. For me, it's a core belief of being a humanist. And for me personally, um, I was at our event yesterday, and I was having a discussion with someone, and actually a wonderful discussion, and this topic came up. And we were talking about how social movements change the society. And they were commenting about how rapid the acceptance of LGBTQIA rights have gone in the past, we'll say 10 to 15 years. There's been an acceleration, right? And we're proud of that. But you can look at other movements that took an awful lot longer to start to make that progress. And we actually touched on, of all people, H.G. Wells. Now, you might not know, but in addition to being a science fiction author, he was a progressive activist, right? And he and his friends formed something called the Fabian Society.
The Fabian
Society. Fabian Society. and they were kind of neo. They were kind of like the first run of socialists and progressives and things like that. And they wanted big change, right? Because you're talking Victorian industrial England. I mean, it's just everything's covered in coal dust, and kids are working in the mines, and it's just awful, awful, right? So they want all that to change. So they named themselves after a Roman general who, when Rome was invaded by Hannibal, they couldn't beat him. Hannibal beat him every battle. So instead of fighting them, at a typical battle, they would nip at their supply lines, or they would find a party that had went to forage for food, and they would attack them. And it is making progress, but where you can, in little ways, and taking what you can without trying to make a big leap. And so that was their strategy for changing society. We'll just gentle pressure, we'll change over time, and things will be better. So I'm having this conversation with someone after the event yesterday, and we talked about that. They were very knowledgeable, fellow historian, and so we talked about that. And I said, what's always bugged me about that is that as much as I like H.G. Wells and many as a sci-fi fan and even a historian of progressivism and things like that, he he didn't have to worry about how fast change was making. He was a straight white man, a successful one. Society was already built for him. What did he need, right? How can you tell someone whose rights are non-existent as far as the government is concerned, or the popular people? How can you tell them wait? But you might have to wait until you're dead, but wait. And as a secular, as a humanist, as an atheist, being told to wait past your lifetime is ridiculous. So when it comes to issues of rights and civil rights and equality, there can be no waiting, which is why you can't have peace if you don't have justice. So I think that is an incredibly important thing. We then have service and participation. We've talked about that here before, but I think it's very important to be engaged with your community. Even Viktor Frankl, a very famous psychologist, that was something important to him, that you had to be engaged. Altruism, doing the right thing for no other reward than it's the right thing to do, and empathy, being able to understand someone else's existence, or those types of things. And then how we engage with the world or existence. And there's two there, really: the environmentalism and the global awareness. Now, if our friend Eric were here, I would just say, talk about environment. There's no one more qualified in this group than Eric to talk about that type of thing. Um, but of course, we've had a number of presentations from Eric on that, so we understand the key importance there. You know, a lot of religious environmentalists talk about how humanities really should be a steward of the environment, because God gave you something and you're supposed to take care of it. And if that makes them be good environmentalists, okay, fine. But um, if a God can tell you to take care of something, then someone else can come along and say, well, God told you to use it all up. It's about where the authority or the motivation comes from. Many of you probably won't remember a guy by the name of James Watt. You guys might remember.
Is this the energy secretary
Yeah,
had
yeah,
his
yeah,
voice?
yeah. Well, that wasn't his key crime, so to speak. But
Okay, I
he was
heard.
he served Ronald Reagan,
Yeah.
and he wanted to tear down the forest, open up the coal mine, just 100% destroy the environment to boost the economy. And when asked about the long-term environmental effects of his policies, he said it doesn't matter because Jesus is coming back. So let's just use everything up. Because you're when that's your philosophy, nothing really matters, and not in a good Freddie Mercury way. Nothing really matters. And so how you think about things and where your motivation comes from, the ethical and logical basis for your decision making matters, because sometimes it will make you do good things even if it's a bad motivation, or a poor motivation. But poor motivation also opens you up to horrible choices. The process matters as much as the result. And then global awareness, um, which I got to say is difficult. I'm going to be honest as I possibly can be here. That's a difficult thing to do. Not simply to be aware. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have a background in history and poli sci, so I like to think I'm pretty aware of things. But it, it's not enough. So I know that some of you here, because I've talked to you about it, watch a show called The Good Place, which is a highly Well, it's one of my very, very favorites. The creator of the show calls it the smartest dumb show on television. Uh, and I think he's wrong. I just think it's one of the smartest shows on television. But they had an episode not too long ago where they talked about how it's impossible to reach the standard of good that their version of heaven says is necessary to be in heaven. And a ethereal character didn't believe it, and they were just follow the rules, just follow the rules, and you'll be fine. But they challenged them to go and spend time on Earth to see for themselves, and they come back and they say, "Gosh, you're right. You know, you want to do the right thing, but there are 15 other things that happen because you do the right thing, and half of those things cause pain to people. You know, you want to give flowers to someone. Well, who do you think picks the flowers, and where do they come from? And oh, by the way, you had to transport those flowers 1,000 miles from the farm where they were grown, and then that puts carbon into the atmosphere. You can't do it. You would have to completely isolate yourself. And while some people have chosen to do that, we all know that's very difficult to do in our life, right? Um, so it's difficult. My take on that is not that individual people. I mean, you do what you can. You know, we recycle. We try not to take unnecessary. You do all those types of things, and that has an impact, but it doesn't have the type of impact you need. Our pressure should really be on huge social changes, um, incentivizing cleaner energy, um, having real regulations on industry and power generation that will make a significant difference in the drop. Because even if we all band together, our impact's actually relatively low. It's large corporations, it's large power generators, it's the government where the difference happens. And for me, that's how I try to focus my energy, because I know that my little household and our 3 recycling bins, and trying not to trying to use energy efficient bulbs and things like that. It's an impact, but it's not what a true impact is going to take. So those are the collection of 10 commitments, and I'd like to turn it over to a conversation now. Um, so, in addition to what you think of them overall, are there things missing? We talked about how 80% of the traditional Judeo-Christian 10 Commandments were essentially wasted as an opportunity to make an ethical law. What about this list?
I don't know, but I will tell you that it's not a political statement. Facts don't matter. I have a friend, a Trump guy. Everything's fake news. Facts don't matter.
Mhm.
And the American people, even bright, aren't smart enough to figure out the difference. So when you talk about this,
Mm-hmm.
you see
Critical
where I'm
thinking, it
going
sounds
with
like
this.
to me.
Huh?
Sounds like to me like you're talking about critical thinking.
Well, yeah, but
Yeah.
what do you do with people like that? Don't matter.
Well, you do have to start somewhere, though. Um, I'm lucky enough to have a 15-year-old, and he is by no measure perfect.
Oh,
Please.
I was with you. I'm never perfect.
But I can tell almost a native's ability when it comes to being swamped with information to start to winnow out what is obvious nonsense. Um, I'm hyper aware of that stuff. So when I see a deep fake video, I know even no matter the quality, I can put the context together, and that's nonsense. You know it's nonsense. Although there is a danger there, but that's another conversation. I feel that a younger generation has a better grasp on what's real and what's not when it comes to digital information. Because if you look at the studies that was done about the 2016 election and the issue you're talking about, most of that was with baby boomers. Just was. They're not digital natives. That's the generation ahead of me. I'm X, so that's the generation ahead of me. Um, we're quasi natives. It happened during our generation, so we have a little bit more familiarity. But boomers are not. My mom and dad are not native to that, and so I did have to sit down with them during that election and say, okay, this is fake and I can prove it, you know, and here's how you know it's fake. And my mom's a progressive, so she was already doubting that stuff, but I had to help out with my dad a little bit to get him around to understanding that this is all nonsense. Um, so first of all, I think the study, like objectively, it's a generational thing, um, and not to be callous, but while we should always make an attempt to have engaged conversations, there is an age that a person reaches where where their thoughts have ossified, they're they're petrified, they're stone, and it pays to focus your attention if you're really trying to change things on younger generations. And that's not to be cruel, or it's just a fact, I think. Anybody else? Things that are missing? Things you're uncomfortable with?
Let's try one more thing.
Okay.
Okay, when I was a kid, 23 years old,
Okay.
I remember running into these people protesting pro-life. And that woman threw me a quote out of the Bible.
Uh-huh.
That abortion was wrong. I don't study the Bible, so I can't tell you what part she's talking
Uh-huh.
about. But another person says it's in the Bible and it contradicts them. So I don't know which part they're talking about, but that is interesting that these pro-life people run around and then there's somewhere else in the Bible. You wouldn't have to know what part of that Bible is.
That's really specific, and I'd have to look it up.
That's Peshka because she can pull it out really quickly.
Right.
She knows it has something to do with like forcing women who have cheated into like giving them something that would like cause a miscarriage, and then if they have a miscarriage, proving that they were adulterers.
Right.
And there's also something about God like choosing babies to kill.
Yep.
But then also like the part that they use to justify that abortion is wrong has to do with like someone getting more punishment for killing a pregnant woman than killing somebody who isn't pregnant. And so their justification is that like that's a life, and that's why you can't do it.
And it's getting to the point about being contradictory.
Yes.
That is the bread and butter of that document. Actually, of most religious documents, unless they were even those religious documents written by one person, those are few and far between. The level of contradiction is emblematic of it being written over long periods of time by multiple authors, and then being translated and retranslated and like a game of telephone down through the centuries. So the problem, and again, I think we're still in the critical thought section there. The problem is that I can personally justify anything if I wanted to be a religious leader, I could justify anything I wanted to by looking through a contradictory Bible or some other thing, or by simply saying, God told me so. And those are the two problems, because the text is so bizarre that I can prove anything by cherry picking parts of it. Or I can just say, God told me. And some religions have that baked in. So the Mormon religion, a key element of their faith is that their leader, their president, directly and non-metaphorically talks to God. And the big example of that, and you have to believe it. It's a core belief. In the late Mormonism from its conception to the late 70s, it was a racist religion, like most American religions. But it explicitly said that African Americans and other Africans were bad people. That they were marked by it was that their skin color was a mark of sin. So in the 1970s, they realized that they couldn't grow their religion if they were excluding an entire continent, right? And so in the 70s, the president of the Mormon Church just talked to God, and he says, "Oh, all that stuff I said about African Americans, I didn't mean it."
Convenient.
Right, convenient. Very convenient when you want to start sending missionaries to Africa. You can't say those things. So whether you want to pull it out of the text or you just want to pull it literally out of thin air, that's what a religion allows you to do. So, any other thoughts on the 10 commitments? On again things that. What about things that should be there? Are they missing something that you think is very important to be there? I mean, they don't specifically call out things like slavery and genocide and those types of things. But you could certainly argue that with things like empathy or altruism or humility, that you can't practice those things and practice this as well. So they've chosen to go at a 10,000 foot level rather than a granular don't do these things. Because if we wanted to make a list of things you shouldn't do, we'd come up with a criminal code, right? It would be volumes long and, all right, but just, that's how it is. Um, so they've taken it to another, to a 10,000-foot level. But that being said, is there anything that's missing, or would you interpret it a different way, or that you find problematic?
I think the responsibility is kind of interesting.
Okay, hey, tell me.
Well, just by working with kids and stuff, I mean, there's no people don't take responsibility for their actions. I mean, and even working in schools, they're not teaching the kids to that they act a certain way. There's consequences.
Hmm.
There's no responsibility. It's like, oh, well, they did that. They have a bad home life, so we're just gonna pat them on the back and be like, it's okay, everything's all right.
Hmm.
Where's the responsibility at?
No, I think that, and it's funny because typically folks who are either non-religious folks are often painted with a broad brush that says that we don't believe in anything, that we don't have values, that we don't have standards, um, and responsibility certainly gets at all those, right? Um, in fact, they would accuse us of doing the type of things that you're saying that you see and don't like, which is again funny because I know plenty. Obviously, I know plenty of folks who are non-religious who set very high standards for their kids. They don't yell at them or scream at them. It's not that type of repressive stand, but they have standards. I mean, my 15-year-old would happily tell you that his mother and I have standards, and if he misses them, things go badly for him for a while in terms of access to video games or getting to go places or things like that. Um, but no, I think. Well, let me share this. So I once had a colleague of mine who was a very devout, still is, Roman Catholic, and of the liberal variety. So, um, but he came to me one day in a bit of a quandary or moral concern, and he said that in working with students, he began to question privately how you could believe in the eternal life equation, the religion equation, and still expect people to be responsible. He said, if I can just get forgiven in the last second of my life, and I'm going to get the same reward as somebody who was as perfect, as close to perfect as one could be for all of their life in terms of religious adherence, what's the point in being responsible? And that's the real argument, by the way, um, that I always argue that secular folks have the potential to be far more ethical than religious folks because we have the real motivation to do so. Pain and fear are not, they're motivators, and that's what religion runs on, but that's not a real, that's just avoiding of pain and fear. It's not actually believing in what you're doing. We have to believe in what we're doing because there is no carrot at the end of the stick. There is no stick. It's just us choosing to want to have a life in a world that means something to us, and part of that is that we're responsible because we choose to be, uh, because the society that we build out of that's better than otherwise. Anyone else?
What's this word ALT mean?
Altruism.
Yeah.
Um, so there's an interesting parallel with Christianity. Christianity would call it agape. And agape is a type of love. It's selfless love, right, for other people. It's not romantic love. It's love you show someone by giving hungry people food or giving homeless people shelter or uh, those types of things, right? The, giving high school students toiletries and not making them jump through hoops to get them. Um, so it goes beyond simply thinking of other people to actually doing things for other people without the expectation of reward or acknowledgement or benefit, other than the general benefit you get from a better society.
Yes.
You know, um, So altruism is that without the religious context.
Thank you. No, he's having cheese. I'm, yeah.
Here.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to eat yours too.
That's okay. So anyone else?
Okay, here's his image.
Thank you. So any other insights into any of the other commitments? Either to interpretation or questions you might have
All right, I
about
want to give you a good example of why this is where we're going.
Okay.
You know, I've been a union person all my
it. I
life.
do.
And some guy told me that in the Bible, God explicitly says the employer should treat the employee good and the employee should honor the employer. And unions are in the way of God's commandments.
Well, again, because you can cherry pick whatever you want to say whatever you want, right?
Wow.
I mean,
Well, someone
okay.
should tell the right about that.
So you know the phrase, oh, and I'm going to mess this up as I always do. It's one of those things I shouldn't, but I will. So to each according to their needs, from each according to their means, or something like that.
Is
Okay.
this Spock?
No, it's not Spock, although I do respect Spock. Um, so okay, so it's from two places, right? It's in the Communist Manifesto, right? Karl Marx, right? Where did Karl Marx get it from? The Bible. It's in the Bible, right? You know what else is in the Bible? Jubilee. Anybody know what the biblical Jubilee is supposed to do? This kills me, by the way. The right would never. They won't talk about this one. So every 50 years, right? There's supposed to be a Jubilee where all private debts are wiped out, and all personal property, like land and things like that, that type of property, is supposed to be evenly redistributed amongst the community every 50 years.
I like socialism.
That might be communism. That
Yeah.
is you know, even communist countries that do that. Not exactly anyway. It is extreme levels of no debts, and we're going to start all over. So here we go. Everybody starts even. That's in the Bible too. So that's why there are Christian communists who say, "Hey, let's go back. Let's keep Christianity great. Let's go back to where we're redistributing property and forgiving debts every 50 years." I assure you, those who celebrate the prosperity gospel, like Olstein and that ilk, don't want to do that, right? So, again, you can justify anything out of there. I certainly can.
Well, slavery's justified in the Bible.
Oh, it certainly is, but you'll also see passages if you want to struggle against slavery where you can pull that stuff out and then because again it's a book of quotes and short stories that have only minimal amounts to do with each other. And I mean, imagine if you took a book about Spider-Man, Batman, and Superman, and you just stapled the stories together in random order and said, "This is your Bible now." What could you justify out of that besides everything?
Well, it's a political document, it's just
Sure is.
stories taken from multiple different regions that everybody who was a part of this massive area could somehow relate to, so therefore they could be controlled by it.
And certainly, the longer it's gone on in existence or redefined, the more political it's gotten. So Justinian and Constantine, especially Constantine, really redefined what the Bible meant. Literally crossing out whole books and saying this does not support what we want for the empire, so it's no longer included. And then over the years, all the reinterpretations, and then you get to King James England. Well, make no mistake, when that was translated into that era's English, that the commission that he put together made sure that it didn't say anything overly problematic to the rule of the king. And now you'll find people saying, well, we need to stick by the original King James version of the Bible. Well, that's not the original version. It's a deeply political document. But then go see some of the new translations, like that are supposed to be in modern English. Well, those are super political too, because now they've just taken out anything that's really problematic to modern Christian sensibilities. All that's been reinterpreted or completely taken out. So it means nothing. Bertrand Russell. he liked to put it this way. He said, it doesn't matter if Jesus was a historical figure or not. It doesn't matter. Because the view we have of that character through the Bible has been so distorted by interpretation and excising text and adding text and reinterpreting text and all of those things for both political and other reasons over the years, that there's no way that that could match anyone who actually existed. It's the longest game of telephone in human history, or one of them anyway. And because of that, you can now you can use it to justify what you want if you're that coming from that point of view. The Ten Commitments, I think what it does, and things like it, but focusing on this, is that it acknowledges that humans create these things. So if we do, we can create the best one possible that makes sense, that aren't contradictory. Those types of.
Well, that I'll bring this up. Christian radio. I know you guys work. I know. They said unless Planned Parenthood, we're quoting here, finds a big corporate donor, they will cease to exist as an efficient organization.
And we talked when Keshka was here, or by internet a couple 2-3 weeks ago. I know she put that rumor to rest very strongly that Planned Parenthood had so much donor money come in after the last presidential election that they're perfectly fine without having to rely on that type of thing.
The government's not going to give them money. They're going to cut them short, right?
Well, they'll try.
Here's the thing. It's not like the government writes Planned Parenthood a check every year and like that's how we get funded. Like there's multiple different avenues that Planned Parenthood receives funding as a nonprofit. A lot of it is donor donations. But I would recommend so our national office has a ton of money, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so there's the Federation of Planned Parenthood that's national, and then there is individual affiliates, like the one that I work for that covers regions or states. And so we have West Virginia, part of Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina are affiliates, Planned Parenthood South Atlantic. But so we get Medicaid reimbursements, and so that's why the ACA fight back in 2017 was so important for us, because if we couldn't get those Medicaid reimbursements, a lot of our patients are on Medicaid if they have insurance. Through the Title X funding, which is the big crisis that we're going, and that's what people are like, oh, they're defunding Planned Parenthood because they took away all this funding from us. Well, it's a huge part of our funding for sure, but it's also by individual affiliate and state. And so for our health center in Vienna, Title X funding is a huge portion of the people that they see. 80-some% of their patients are Title X patients because they don't have access to insurance or money. But for example, certain states, you can't even use Title X funding at Planned Parenthood. So in South Carolina, this isn't even an issue for the health centers down there, because they, by the state's laws, can't use Title X funding at all. So it all is dependent on that. So I guess what I'm saying here is we're not going to get defunded, but it is going to mean changing possibly the ways that our healthcare looks. I know that our affiliate's looking into adding primary care into the health centers to kind of compensate for the loss of the Title X funding and other healthcare services. But if you want to donate your money to Planned Parenthood, donate it to our affiliate, not the national level, because if you go through the links of emails and stuff that you get from the national office, it just donates the money to the national office, and trust me, they've got enough. So donate it to the affiliate.
Right.
Well, let me finish the notice. Okay, let me think about this thing. They're saying if we just put all Christian representatives, you vote them in, we can do away with this gay marriage thing. We can do away with abortion. Because the government
not funded by the government.
No. They make it sound like the government is funding all this.
Oh, of course they do.
And if you just put these people away, we will practically do away with them because they'll get no government funding.
Well, that's what they want people to think, because they want you to elect those folks, and so they think that if you have these issues that matter a lot to you, and you think you can do something about it by electing these people. I mean, it's the same reason we elect people that reflect our values, right? Because we want them to get into office and do this. But they're being disingenuous, because in fact the government doesn't have the power to shut down Planned Parenthood. We're a nonprofit. We're not we are not fully funded by the government by any means. We don't work for the government.
It's the standard trick that religion has pulled for probably since its birth or existence, and that is the idea that we will promise you X if you give us your money and your obedience, but we never actually have to deliver on X. All we have to deliver on is earning our money and your obedience, because that's really what it's about. It was blatant at the dawn of civilization, where agricultural communities, the king was the priest, and there was it was just blatant out there. We've developed as a species. We've tried to separate church and state, and so that people can have their beliefs, but it doesn't limit what other
And yet
people
we
can
still
do.
keep letting preachers be our representatives
That's
in
right.
office.
That's right.
And think that somehow they're going to separate their values
And
from
be
what
tax
they're doing for
free,
the government.
and yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to ask for what victory can Planned Parenthood claim today? They got 2 Supreme Court justices they put on there, definitely not, you know what I'm talking about, conservatives. That's what they're putting up there, conservatives everywhere, you know what I mean? What does Planned Parenthood plan to do? I just put another, Gandhi, he shut the whole country down in India over something, remember that?
I do, but I think we're in a very different place than what Gandhi was
Yeah, but you're
dealing
gonna have
with.
these conservative judges being put in left and right by Trump.
Well, like, first of all, Planned Parenthood's not a government entity, so
It
like,
doesn't
there's
matter
not.
if they rule, well, whatever.
I mean, we put
That
a lot
way
of.
they can do that, you know what I'm saying?
We put a lot of like people power and action and money behind elections, and we flipped a ton of seats and gotten on. We currently have the most pro-choice House that we've ever seen.
Sure do.
Because of all the seats that we flipped, but also like, I mean, at the end of the day, the victory is the healthcare that we continue to provide.
Yeah.
Like that is at the end of the day, above anything else, providing healthcare to people. So if that means getting policies passed, like expanding access to resources like the ACA and protecting the ACA, and I know this, like, some people don't love it, but Medicare for all, like something like that, where we can make sure that people can easily access the kinds of services that we want to provide, and creating an environment that is safe for everybody to access them.
Here, and just for my 2 cents, I mean, and not to be too simplistic about it, but I really think this is, if you want a clear call to action, the more women who get voted into federal and state office, and local too, but mainly federal and state, the more female representatives we have, the less likely that female rights and reproductive rights are going to have any vulnerability.